At my niece's christening, my aunt whispered loudly, "Don't sit up front. You're not core family." The congregation snickered. I'd donated the church renovations. So I withdrew the pledge mid-service, sparking a whispered frenzy as the pastor announced the shortfall. I, 35M, never considered myself a petty person. I believed in taking the high road, in letting slights roll off my back. But there's something about public humiliation in a place of worship that changes a man's perspective on forgiveness. The christening was scheduled for 11 in the morning at St. Augustine's, the same church where 3 generations of our family had been baptized, married, and eulogized. My brother and his wife had chosen it specifically because of that history, and I'd been genuinely excited to see my niece welcomed into the fold. I'd even taken the morning off work, something I rarely did on Sundays given my schedule. I arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in my best suit, carrying a substantial gift I'd spent weeks selecting. The church looked magnificent. The stained glass windows gleamed, the pews shone with fresh polish, and the stone facade outside had been cleaned to its original honey-colored glory. I felt a quiet pride seeing it. 6 months earlier, the church had been crumbling. Water damage had warped the floor, the roof leaked, and the sound system crackled like a dying radio. The renovation estimate had come to nearly $200,000, a sum the small congregation could never raise alone. I'd written the check without hesitation. My tech startup had recently been acquired, and while I wasn't billionaire rich, I had more money than I'd ever imagined having. The church had been part of my childhood, a place where my late mother had found peace during her final years. Funding the restoration felt like honoring her memory. The pastor had been overwhelmed with gratitude, and they'd even planned a small dedication plaque, though I'd asked them to keep my contribution quiet. I didn't need recognition. I just wanted the space preserved. As I walked through those restored doors that morning, I nodded to familiar faces. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in months. The church was filling up quickly. I made my way down the center aisle toward the front, where family typically sat during christenings. My brother had texted me earlier in the week reminding me to arrive early so we could all sit together up front. I was 3 rows from the altar when my aunt materialized beside me. She was my father's older sister, a woman who'd always carried herself with an inflated sense of authority within the family. She'd never particularly liked me, something I'd accepted years ago. Her sons were doctors and lawyers, respectable professions in her eyes. My career in tech had always seemed frivolous to her, despite its success. She placed a hand on my shoulder, stopping me mid-stride. Her voice carried that particular volume people use when they want to seem like they're whispering but ensure everyone hears. The acoustics in the renovated church were excellent, which meant her words reached every ear in the sanctuary. She told me I should sit toward the back, that the front rows were reserved for core family members. She emphasized those words, core family, with unmistakable meaning. Her tone suggested I was some distant relation rather than the child's uncle. She gestured vaguely toward the rear pews where a few latecomers and church regulars typically sat. The sanctuary went quiet. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Someone behind me snickered, then another. The sound rippled through the pews like a wave. My face burned. My aunt smiled, that tight, satisfied smile of someone who'd just put someone in their place. She patted my shoulder as though she'd done me a favor and turned back toward the front row where her husband was already seated. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of it. This was my brother's daughter. I was her uncle. I'd driven 2 hours to be here, and I'd rebuilt the very building we were standing in. But none of that seemed to matter in the face of my aunt's bizarre power play. I walked backward up the aisle and slid into a pew near the rear. My brother caught my eye from the front and looked confused, mouthing something I couldn't make out. I shook my head slightly, not wanting to cause a scene before his daughter's christening. The snickering had mostly died down, replaced by whispered conversations. I caught fragments, people speculating about family drama, others clearly amused by my aunt's performance. The service began with the usual hymns and readings. The baby, my niece, looked angelic in her white gown, oblivious to the pettiness of adults. My brother and sister-in-law stood at the altar with the godparents, all smiles. My aunt sat in the front row, her posture radiating satisfaction. I tried to focus on the ceremony, but rage was building in my chest like pressure in a sealed container. I'd been publicly humiliated for the crime of existing, for not meeting whatever arbitrary standard my aunt had decided mattered. And everyone had just watched it happen. Some had even laughed. My phone was in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out carefully, angling it so no one could see the screen. I opened my banking app and navigated to my scheduled payments. There it was, the pledge to St. Augustine's. The full amount hadn't been paid up front. Instead, I'd structured it as quarterly installments over 2 years. They'd received the first payment, which covered the initial emergency repairs. The remaining $150,000 was divided into 7 more payments. I stared at the screen. The next payment was scheduled for the end of this month. My finger hovered over the cancellation button. This was nuclear, I knew that. But the humiliation was still fresh, the snickering still echoing in my ears. I canceled the pledge. Then I went further. I accessed the separate payment I'd set up for ongoing maintenance, a small monthly amount I'd committed to for 5 years. Canceled. I sat back, my heart pounding. The deed was done, but no one knew yet. Part of me wanted to stand up and announce it, to watch the smug expression drain from my aunt's face. But I waited. Patience would make this so much sweeter. The christening proceeded. The pastor spoke about community and family, about supporting one another and building a spiritual home together. The irony wasn't lost on me. When it came time for the actual baptism, I watched as he anointed my niece's forehead with oil. She started to cry, and everyone chuckled warmly. It was a beautiful moment, exactly what my brother and his wife had wanted. Then came the announcements. This was a tradition at St. Augustine's. After the main service, but before the final blessing, the pastor would share church news, upcoming events, and financial updates. Usually, it was perfunctory, barely noticed by most attendees. The pastor cleared his throat and thanked everyone for attending. He mentioned the upcoming church fair and a Bible study group starting on Wednesday. Then his expression shifted, becoming uncertain. He glanced down at a tablet one of the church administrators had just handed him, and I watched his face pale. He explained that he'd just received concerning news about the church finances. He stumbled over his words, clearly trying to maintain composure. He said that a significant pledge that had been supporting their restoration project had just been withdrawn. He didn't name me, but he didn't need to. The renovation had been major news in the congregation, and while I'd asked for anonymity, enough people knew or had guessed. He stated the amount, $150,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Someone gasped. The pastor continued, explaining that this left them in a precarious position. They'd already contracted work based on the pledge. The roof repairs were scheduled for next month. The new heating system was on order. Without that money, they'd be unable to complete the restoration and might even face debt. The whispering started immediately. It began in the back rows and spread forward like wildfire. People turned to their neighbors, hands cupped over mouths, eyes wide with shock. The beautiful acoustics that had broadcast my humiliation now carried their panic through every corner of the building. I sat perfectly still, my expression neutral. My aunt had turned in her seat, craning her neck to scan the congregation. She was clearly trying to figure out what had happened. Who could have possibly withdrawn such a massive pledge? Her eyes passed over me without recognition. In her mind, I was just the disappointing nephew who worked with computers. I couldn't possibly be someone important enough to fund church renovations. The pastor tried to regain control of the room. He asked people to remain calm and assured them that they would find a solution. But the frenzy had already begun. Church board members were standing, huddling together near the altar. The whispered conversations grew louder, less discreet. My brother looked stricken. This was supposed to be his daughter's special day, and now it was being overshadowed by financial crisis. I felt a pang of guilt about that, but I pushed it aside. He'd watched his aunt humiliate me and hadn't intervened. He'd let me walk to the back of the church like some unwanted stranger. One of the church elders, a man I'd worked with directly on the renovation planning, suddenly stood up. He looked directly at me. I saw the recognition dawn on his face, followed by horror. He knew. He'd been present when I signed the pledge paperwork. He started to make his way toward my pew, but the crowd was thick, and people were still whispering frantically. My aunt had finally connected the dots. I watched it happen in real time. She'd turned to speak with the elder's wife, who'd whispered something while glancing in my direction. My aunt's face transformed. The smug satisfaction evaporated, replaced by dawning comprehension and then outright panic. She stood abruptly, her purse tumbling from her lap onto the polished floor. She pushed past people in her row, ignoring their protests. She was making her way toward me, her expression desperate. but I was already standing. I'd seen enough. I'd accomplished what I came to do, even if it hadn't been my original intention when I dressed that morning. I walked up the side aisle toward the exit. People reached out to stop me, asking questions, but I kept moving. The pastor called out, asking me to wait, to speak with him. I ignored him too. My aunt's voice rose above the chaos, calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I stepped out into the bright morning sunlight and took a deep breath. The church bells were silent. Inside, I could still hear the commotion, voices rising and falling. My phone started buzzing immediately. My brother calling, then my father, then the pastor. I silenced it and walked to my car. Update 1. I spent the rest of Sunday ignoring calls and messages. By evening, I had over 40 missed calls and twice as many texts. The family group chat was exploding. My father demanded I call him immediately. My aunt sent a long, rambling message about misunderstandings and how I'd embarrassed the family. My brother's messages were different, hurt, confused, asking what had happened and why I'd ruined his daughter's christening. That one stung. I hadn't wanted to ruin the christening. I'd wanted to witness it, to celebrate my niece. But I'd been publicly humiliated and had reacted. Maybe not in the most mature way, but I'd reacted nonetheless. By Monday morning, I'd received 3 emails from the church. The first was from the pastor, asking me to reconsider. He explained the position the church was now in and how many people depended on the completed renovations. The second was from the church board, more formal, inquiring about my reasons and whether there was anything they could do to resolve the situation. The third was from the elder who'd recognized me during the service. His message was personal, almost pleading. He reminded me of the conversations we'd had about my mother, about preserving her memory through the church restoration. That one almost broke me. Almost. Tuesday brought a visit to my office. My father showed up unannounced, looking older than I remembered. His face was drawn, and he clearly hadn't slept well. He sat across from my desk and asked me what had happened. I told him everything. The humiliation, the snickering, the way his sister had treated me like an outsider in front of the entire congregation. I explained about the pledge and my decision to withdraw it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me my aunt was devastated. She'd apparently spent all of Sunday evening calling relatives, trying to explain and defend her actions. She claimed she hadn't meant anything by her comment, that I'd overreacted, that I was destroying the church out of spite. I asked my father if he'd witnessed what happened. He admitted he had, that he'd been sitting near the front and had heard her clearly. I pressed him. Had he thought it was appropriate? Had he considered intervening? He looked away, uncomfortable. He said family dynamics were complicated and that my aunt often spoke without thinking. I told him that her speaking without thinking had publicly humiliated me, and that the congregation's laughter had made it clear how they viewed me within the family hierarchy. I'd simply removed my financial support from people who found my humiliation amusing. If that made me the villain, I could live with it. My father left without another word. The look on his face told me I'd disappointed him, but I was beyond caring. I'd spent 35 years trying to meet various family expectations, and it had gotten me nothing but contempt. Wednesday brought a surprise visitor. My sister-in-law came alone, without my brother. She sat in my living room and cried. She told me the christening had been ruined, that family members were fighting, that the church was in chaos. She begged me to reconsider the pledge, not for my aunt's sake, but for my niece's. I asked her why I should care about family unity when family had made it clear I wasn't really part of the core group. She didn't have an answer. She tried a different approach, suggesting that maybe I'd misunderstood my aunt's intentions, that perhaps it had been a misguided attempt at humor. I pulled out my phone and played a video I'd found online. Someone in the congregation had been filming the beginning of the service and had caught the entire interaction on camera. The audio was crystal clear. You could hear my aunt's voice, the deliberate emphasis on core family, and the unmistakable snickering that followed. My sister-in-law watched, her face crumpling. She apologized. She said she hadn't realized how bad it was, that from the front she'd only seen me move to the back and had assumed it was my choice. She admitted my brother had told her to stay out of it, that he didn't want to get involved in family drama before his daughter's big moment. I told her I understood, but that my decision stood. She left, and I felt worse than I had before she arrived. Maybe I was being petty. Maybe I was letting pride dictate my actions. But I couldn't shake the memory of that laughter, of being treated as lesser by people I'd quietly helped for years. Update 2. By the weekend, things had escalated beyond what I'd anticipated. The church had gone public with their financial crisis, putting out a call to the congregation and community for emergency donations. Local news picked up the story. Small-town church faces financial ruin after major donor withdraws support. They didn't name me, but in a town this size, everyone knew. I became the villain in the community narrative. People I'd known for years crossed the street to avoid me. The coffee shop, where I'd been a regular for a decade, suddenly had staff who were too busy to take my order. Someone spray-painted "Traitor" on my driveway. My business partner called, concerned about the publicity affecting our company. I assured him it wouldn't, that this was personal and separate from work. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. Reputation mattered in business, and mine was currently being shredded. The church managed to raise about $20,000 from the emergency campaign. It wasn't nearly enough. The contractors they'd hired were threatening to sue for breach of contract. The roof repairs had been postponed indefinitely, and winter was coming, which meant the heating system would soon be critical. My phone rang late Saturday night. It was the elder who'd emailed me, the one who'd worked with me on the renovation plans. His voice was tired. He told me he understood why I was angry, that what my aunt had done was wrong. But he asked me to consider the broader impact of my decision. He reminded me that the church served over 300 families. Many were struggling financially. They used the space for community meals, support groups, youth programs. The building wasn't just a Sunday morning venue. It was a lifeline for people who had nothing to do with my family drama. I asked him why none of those 300 families had intervened when I was being publicly mocked. Why the community that now called me traitor had found my humiliation amusing enough to laugh at. He had no answer except to say that people often fail to act in the moment. That crowd mentality makes cowards of good people. I told him I'd think about it and ended the call. I didn't sleep that night. I kept seeing my niece's face during the baptism, so innocent and unaware of the adult chaos surrounding her. I thought about my mother and how she'd loved that church, how she'd found comfort there during her illness. I wondered what she'd think of me now. Sunday morning, I made a decision. I got dressed and drove to St. Augustine's. I arrived just as the service was starting and slipped into the back pew, the same one I'd sat in during the christening. The church was fuller than usual, probably people coming to gawk at the financial drama. The pastor saw me immediately. His entire sermon seemed directed at me, about forgiveness and community, about putting aside pride for the greater good. It was heavy-handed, and several people turned to look at me during particularly pointed moments. But I sat through it, unmoved. After the service, I approached the pastor directly. I told him I would restore the pledge, but with conditions. The announcement would make clear that my initial withdrawal was due to being publicly humiliated by a family member during a sacred ceremony, and that such behavior was antithetical to the church's stated values of love and inclusion. My aunt would publicly apologize, not just to me, but to the congregation for disrupting my niece's christening with her behavior. And the dedication plaque they'd planned would be installed as originally designed. The pastor looked uncomfortable, but agreed to bring my conditions to the church board. I left before anyone else could corner me. I'd said what I needed to say. Update 3. The church board met on Tuesday evening. I received a call Wednesday morning. They'd accepted my conditions, though the pastor's voice suggested it hadn't been unanimous. The announcement would be made during the following Sunday's service, and my aunt had reluctantly agreed to the public apology. Sunday arrived. I wore the same suit I'd worn to the christening. This time, when I walked down the center aisle, no one stopped me. In fact, people seemed to lean away, as though I were radioactive. My aunt sat in her usual spot, her face pale and drawn. She'd aged years in the 2 weeks since the christening. The pastor made the announcement during the regular update section. He explained the situation in careful, diplomatic language. He stated that a misunderstanding during the recent christening had led to the withdrawal of a major pledge. He emphasized that the church stood for inclusivity and respect, and that all members of the congregation were valued equally. He announced that the pledge had been restored and that renovations would continue as planned. Then my aunt stood. She walked to the front, her hands shaking. She turned to face the congregation and apologized. She admitted that she'd spoken thoughtlessly, that she'd caused disruption during what should have been a joyous occasion. She said she'd failed to consider how her words might impact others, and that she was sorry for any hurt she'd caused. It was stilted and clearly painful for her, but she did it. When she looked at me specifically and apologized directly, I nodded once. It wasn't warm, but it was acknowledgement. She returned to her seat, and the pastor quickly moved on to the closing hymn. After the service, people approached me cautiously. Some thanked me for restoring the pledge. Others seemed to want to say something, but couldn't find the words. My brother finally made his way over with my sister-in-law and my niece. He asked if we could talk, and we stepped outside into the churchyard. He apologized for not intervening during the christening. He admitted he'd been so focused on his daughter and the ceremony that he'd failed to consider what I was experiencing. He said he should have stood up for me and that he was sorry he hadn't. His wife echoed the apology, holding my niece, who reached out her tiny hand toward me. I took my niece's hand gently. She wrapped her fingers around mine and smiled. In that moment, surrounded by the church I'd helped restore, holding my brother's daughter, I felt the rage that had sustained me for 2 weeks finally start to dissipate. I told them I forgave them, and I meant it. My father approached as my brother's family walked away. He looked uncomfortable but determined. He told me he'd spoken with his sister, that she understood the gravity of what she'd done. He said family wasn't always easy, but that it was worth fighting for. I told him I agreed, but that family also meant standing up when someone was being mistreated, not waiting until after the damage was done to offer support. He nodded slowly. It wasn't a full resolution, but it was something. We stood together in silence, watching the congregation file out, greeting each other, forming the small clusters and connections that made a community. For better or worse, this was still my community. These flawed, complicated people were still my family. The dedication plaque was installed a month later. It reads simply, "In memory of a beloved mother who found peace within these walls." At the unveiling, the pastor spoke about grace and second chances, about how buildings were just structures until people filled them with purpose. My aunt attended but kept her distance. We haven't spoken directly since her apology, and I'm not sure we will anytime soon. My relationship with my brother has slowly improved. We have lunch every few weeks, and I visit my niece regularly. She won't remember any of this chaos, which is probably for the best. She'll grow up in a church with a sound roof and warm pews, never knowing the cost of adult pride and public humiliation. The congregation still treats me with a mixture of respect and wariness, as though I'm a bomb that might detonate again. Maybe I am. I learned something about myself during those 2 weeks. I have limits, boundaries that I'm willing to defend even when it costs me. I'm not sure if that makes me strong or just stubborn, but I've made peace with it. The church bells ring every Sunday morning now, clear and bright through the restored tower. Sometimes I attend services, sometimes I don't. But when I do walk through those doors, I walk down the center aisle and sit wherever I please. And no one, core family or otherwise, has suggested I do anything different. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.